Hi, I'm Chelsea of Friday Pattern Company, and I'm really excited today to bring you the Saltwater Slip sew along. In this video, we're going to go over a little bit of advice on fitting your slip, and then we'll go into preparing your pattern to sew and then actually step-by-step sewing it. I really hope this video can make the pattern even just a little bit more accessible for beginning sewists, because I think this is a gratifying thing to sew. It's a wardrobe essential that you can make a ton of times in like different fabrics, different ways. You've got multiple length options, you have optional side ties, and I've made personally, I think like 6, and they are honestly in rotation in my wardrobe because you can wear them under things, you can wear them over things, you can wear them on your own, and once you get the hang of actually making it, you can just like bang them out. This video is meant to be a complement to the instructions that came with your pattern, so if you haven't picked up your pattern already, I'll put a link in the description box below. You'll want to get that printed and get your pattern pieces cut out, and then we'll take it from there. The first thing you're going to want to do is take a couple measurements to find your fit. So the two most important measurements are going to be your full bust, which is the fullest part around your chest. And you want to wrap the measuring tape around your body, and then I like to let my arms relax and then also take a breath to kind of let it settle, and then you'll get that measurement. Next measurement we need is our hips. So I wrap the measuring tape around the fullest part of my butt and hips. And you want to get that on there, and you could do this in your underwear. I'm wearing leggings for, the YouTube, but you measure around and you can let it be taut, but it shouldn't be restrictive. So give a little wiggle if you need to, and you'll get your measurement. For a lot of bodies, your bust and hips and waist might all fall into different sizes. So what you'll want to do in that case is to blend between sizes. I'm blending between a medium in the bust and a large at the hips. The two notches on your side seam are a great place to blend between. So all you have to do is draw a line connecting the two sizes, and you can see that in this illustration in red. And that is a great way to create a pattern that is more suited to your specific body. Here are the supplies we'll need. We've got pins, we've got our little strap kit that has the loops and sliders in it. This is a 3-pack, it's got black, white, and clear. Scissors, I've got thread, and then this fabric we're going to use for the slip is a cotton linen blend. And then I have the instructions printed out, and I only printed out the necessary pages. I didn't print out the beginning just to save paper. Before we get started sewing, we are going to mark our pattern pieces in a few ways. And the first is clipping notches. So with the pattern piece pinned to your fabric, cut out pattern pieces, you're just going to clip in just with some scissors at all of the notches. This is just a little reference point for you so that when you're sewing you can match things up. Next up, we will mark our darts. So I have pinned this to the wrong side of my fabric because the right side and the wrong side look the same with this fabric. Grab my pattern piece and I'll use paper scissors to trim up one leg of the dart, and then I'll be able to fold that under to expose like the full triangle of the dart. And then you can lay that over your piece and use some chalk or whatever marking tool you want to mark your dart on the wrong side of your front piece. And then you'll flip it around and you can do the other side. So there's a dart on each side of the wrong side of your front piece. The final mark that we need to make on our pattern pieces, this is only if you're making the long version, is to mark the circle or drill marks for the size that you're making. And because I blended to a large at the hips, I'm marking the large circle. And then I just like to stick a pin through both pieces and then use a pen to make a little mark, and then do that on the other one. And obviously you can use something that will disappear. I wanted you to be able to see this, so I used a marker. Time to start sewing. So you're gonna grab your strap binding E pieces and pin them right sides together along this diagonal edge. And the way that they overlap, there will be these 3/8 inch dog ears on either side. And then at your sewing machine, you are going to sew those together along that diagonal edge using your 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then you'll just carefully trim off those little dog ears. Now we're at our iron because we have a ton of pressing to do. The first thing we're going to do is press that seam that we just sewed open. Now we're going to press all the binding and strap pieces. So that is pieces E, C, D, and then F if you're adding side ties. I'm demonstrating on piece C because it's easy to see. But basically you are folding the piece in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and pressing. And then you're going to fold the raw edges in to meet that center fold, and you'll press that all the way down. There are lots of tools and tricks out there for doing this in a more expedited fashion. And bias tape makers are actually not very expensive, but for the sew along, I just wanted to show you how you can do it without any extra tools. So I'm just carefully folding and pressing, and be careful because your fingers are close to the iron while you're doing this. Now I'm just repeating that process with my strap loop D pieces. And here's the biggie, I am just repeating that process with strap binding E, which is now one big long piece. So all this pressing takes a little while, but once it's done, and we're smooth sailing through the rest of the sewing. Just kidding, there's other stuff, but it's not hard. And because I'm pretty sure you get the idea, I also did this to the side ties, but I'm not going to show it in this sew along. Now it is time to edge stitch our side ties. So we have it all pressed nicely, and I'm just lining it up at the machine. And for these, I think it's actually easier to center the tie so that it is somewhere where it can flow easily under your presser foot, and then scoot your needle over. So I'm moving my needle over so that it's 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge. It's not centered on my thing, and I'm just testing it out here to see where it's going to lay. And this is a great trick for getting close to the edge without risk of your piece being sucked down into your feed dogs and jamming up, which I'm sure we've all experienced. And then you'll just sew down to the end and then repeat on the other tie. Now we're going to stay stitch the necklines, and we're starting with the front. So you're going to stay stitch down the armhole and then in towards the center along the neckline, and then down the other neck hole. And you're also going to stay stitch the back neckline starting at the sides and going towards the center. Stay stitching is done by sewing 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fabric, and you want to be really careful not to let your piece hang so that it stretches and warps, because really what stay stitching is for is to prevent your curved areas from warping while you're sewing. So like while you're sewing other stuff, they're getting stretched out because of the weight of the fabric or like potentially pulling on them. So I'm starting with that armhole, and then I'll work from towards the center on the neckline and the other armhole. You just do it kind of carefully. With a more sturdy fabric like this cotton, it's not as crucial. Obviously you still want to do it, but if you're working with like a silk or something that has that kind of looser weave, they really can stretch out a lot. So stay stitching is important. After you've stay stitched the front and back necklines, we're going to join the 2 back B pieces along the center back seam. So you've got a double notch on your center back seam, so you know that you're not sewing like the 2 sides together. So just match up those notches and then pin all the way down. And now we're at the sewing machine, and we're just going to use our 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew from the neckline all the way down to the hem. The center back seam needs to be finished, and I'm using my serger to finish the edge just for a quick finish, but you could use a zigzag stitch or whatever your preferred method is. But basically just finish this center back seam, and then we'll meet back at our iron. If you finish your center back seams separately, then you can press that seam open, or if you finished it like me, finishing the 2 sides raw edges together, then you can press it to one side. Dealer's choice. So you're going to edge stitch your strap loop D pieces the same way that you did the side ties, and then grab your rings from your hardware kit and then just slide the ring onto strap loop D and fold it over, and then we will pin it in place on the wrong side of back B, matching up with the notches that are on the neckline. So you'll repeat that on both sides, and then we'll take it over to the sewing machine to baste it in place. To baste those, you'll just use a straight stitch 1/4 inch from the edge, and you're just going to sew across the strap loops so that those are held in place while we construct the rest of our slip. Now we're adding binding to the neckline of our front piece A. So grab your neckline binding piece C, and I like to do this right side up, but you'll grab your piece and you're just going to pin the binding in place along that center curved edge of the neckline. And you just wrap the binding around the raw edge of the fabric and pin carefully across so that the folded edges of the binding are meeting up on either side, because we're going to edge stitch these in place. Don't worry if you have a little excess at the end, that'll just get trimmed off. Binding stretches in different amounts depending on the fabric you're using, so you have a little wiggle room here, and it's meant to be trimmed off at the end. Get set up at the machine and you'll carefully sew 1/8 inch from that folded edge, and you're going to work your way down the neckline carefully, just kind of feeling as you go to make sure that you are catching both sides of the binding with the raw edge of the front neckline sandwiched in the middle. And once that's sewn, you can just trim any excess that you have to match the angle of the front A. Now we sew the darts on front A, and you're looking at the wrong side here, and I'm sorry this goes out of frame, but basically I'm using pins to match up my marked dart legs, and I like to put a pin kind of at the beginning, and then I throw one in at the point, and I can kind of see when I'm pinning it if the legs are matched up, and then you can put one in the middle for good measure. Here at the machine, we're using our marked dart line as a guide to sew down, so I'm just sewing down that line, and as I approach the point, I get close as I can to the edge of the fabric, still catching some threads of the fabric, and take a few stitches that way, and then I sew off the edge and let it sew probably like 5 or 6 times. And I know it seems weird, but it twists up together, and then my darts never come unraveled. You can also, some people like to backstitch darts, which I think is very risky, or you could leave these threads long and tie them off. Once you've sewn both of your darts, press them downward, and then if you're adding the side ties, we're going to do that now. So grab those and then match the raw edge of your tie up with the notch on the first notch on your side seam of your front piece A. And we'll just pin those in place and then baste them the same method that we used when we basted the strap loops in place. Here are those basted in place. And now we are going to finish the side seams of our front A and back B in preparation to join those two pieces together. So you're going to finish down the side, and if you're making the long version, you only finish down to that curved edge and you don't finish this bottom part. So finish both sides of your front A and your back B, and then we will pin those right sides together. If you were making the short version, you would pin from neckline to hem here, but we're making the long version, so we're going to pin from neckline to the circle mark or drill hole. So we'll just start at the top, pin our way down, and then when we get to the hole, you can stick a pin in the hole and then make sure that it's matching up on both sides. Once you have that all lined up, we're ready to take this over to the sewing machine and sew. Again, in this step, we're only sewing from the neckline down to that circle mark, and we're going to backstitch at that circle mark. So starting at the neckline, use your 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew down to the circle mark. As you approach it, slow down and then backstitch right at your mark. So we've sewn down to the circle mark, and now we are going to sew from the circle mark down to the hem. So the seam allowance increases here to 3/4 inch, and you're just gonna, starting at that circle mark, You're going to increase your stitch length to 4.5 to 5 millimeters long, and you're going to sew down to the hem. And don't do any back stitching here at the beginning or the end, because this will get removed later. Repeat that on both sides, and then we'll head over to our iron to press the raw edges under on our side slits. So you're going to press your side seam open, and then on the side slit where you still have the raw edge of the fabric because you haven't finished it, you're going to press the raw edges under so that they meet your seam line. And then pin that in place so that we can take it over to the sewing machine and edge stitch around, making a super clean side slit. And you'll repeat that on both sides. Okay, here we go. We're gonna edge stitch up one side of our side slit until we get to the top of where we have it folded. And then we'll lower our needle and lift our presser foot, and then we can pivot our project so that we can sew straight across the top of our side slit. And then you'll pivot again and you'll sew down the other side of the side slit all the way to the hem. And repeat that on both sides. All right, this next step is a big one, but it's quite gratifying. You are going to grab your strap binding E, and this is gonna wrap around the back neckline and then those underarms and then up, and it'll form the straps all in one piece. So we're gonna fold it in half to find the center, and we're gonna match that up with our center back seam and just pin that in place. And I think it's easier to work out from center back, so I'll go one side at a time, pinning outward around the back neckline and then up around the underarm, and then there's more at the end that will be pinned, just folded in half, and that's our straps. And then you'll just go in the opposite direction, pinning up around the neckline and forming the straps. And I think all of this is easier to do with the right side facing up. And just make sure that when you're pinning it, you're feeling to make sure that those folded edges are kind of matched up around the raw edge of the fabric. This will just make it so much easier, making sure that nothing gets slipped or missed when you are sewing. So now we edge stitch starting at the end of one of our straps. You're gonna just make sure that it's not like tangled. So you'll start at the end and you'll just edge stitch down the strap 1/8 of an inch from that folded edge where the two pieces are folded together, and then it'll join onto your neckline, and then you'll sew all the way around the neckline and then down the other strap. Easy as pie. Woohoo! Take a minute to admire how awesome your slip is looking after that last step. I just find that so gratifying. So depending on the type of fabric you're using, the straps might have stretched along the way. So we want to trim the straps down to 20 inches. If they're longer, you can just trim them off. For me, this fabric's pretty sturdy. It didn't really stretch, so I am good. Now we're gonna press our strap loops upward and just edge stitch them in place along the edge of our neckline binding, and that'll just keep them up. And so just take them to your machine and sew 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge of that binding and just backstitch to make sure they're secure. Here's what that looks like finished. Time to form the adjustable strap. So lay your slip out and grab your slider from your hardware kit. And then you're going to make sure that your strap is not twisted, and you're just going to slide it on to the strap. So push the strap through one of the openings over that center bar and then out the other side. You can give yourself a little room by sliding the slider upward, and then it's going to loop through the ring on our strap loop piece. And then you're gonna pull the end of your strap through your slider again. This gets a little bit tight, so I think it's easiest to pull out your strap a little bit to create some room, and then you can also see what's going on. And you're gonna pull the strap underneath the strap that's already on the slider. So I can usually get this through just kind of shoving it and then pinching it, but you can use tweezers if you're having a hard time getting it through, and also pull the strap that's already on the slider away, and it'll give you a little bit more room. So just pull it through the first opening and then out the other side. Once you have that end pulled through, it's going to get sewn to the lower side of your strap. So you'll kind of pin that in place, and then we can work this out and take it over to the sewing machine to sew. So here we are at the sewing machine to sew that end to our lower strap. I want to give it a little snip just to clean up that edge before we sew it, because it got, you know, pulled through and pinched. So you can just clean up that edge and then pin it nicely to the lower strap. Set that end up so that it's centered underneath your needle on your feed dog, and set your machine up to a zigzag stitch. And then we're just gonna zigzag across, kind of encasing that like raw edge. And we'll backstitch a couple of times to make sure this is super secure. And then you can repeat on both sides and you've got an adjustable strap. We are almost done. All that is left to do is hem our slip. So bring your slip over to your iron, and we're gonna press the raw edge of the hem under 3/8 of an inch, and then you'll press it under 3/8 of an inch again, and then we'll take it over to the machine to sew. So now to hem it. Hemming the short version versus the long version is a little different. So for the long version, we're gonna start at the side seam, and we are going to edge stitch. So you'll back stitch at the beginning of your stitch, and then you'll stitch to the other side seam, and then you'll back stitch and end that stitch. Don't sew over the side seam, and then you'll repeat on the other half of your dress. If you were making the short version, you can just edge stitch all the way around the hem of your dress. The reason that we stop at the side seam and backstitch and end our stitch is because we are going to open that side seam. So we don't want to sew over it, because then we would be breaking our seam. So now we are going to open up our side slits. This is obviously, if you're making the short version, you're done. Don't worry about this. But for us longies, so just grab your seam ripper, and then you can open up just the bottom of that side seam. And because this stitch is long, it should come apart really easily. And I like to do a mixture of seam ripping and then also a little bit of like pulling lightly, and then grabbing the thread and kind of pulling on it, because eventually you'll just pull the thread straight out, and that'll give you like a great indication of where the stitches ended, so that you don't accidentally like try to seam rip into where you backstitched and where that, you know, seam starts to go up your side seam. So yeah, just carefully work your way up and pull on that thread, and when you get close to the top, it'll probably just pull right out. And if you have slippery fabric, it might just pull all the way out on its own. It's very satisfying. Here is the finished slip, and I love it so much. I know it's going to become a beloved member of my wardrobe family. From a lightweight kind of linen cotton blend, and it's going to be perfect for the heat. And I've got this is a closet core pattern, the netty bodysuit that's actually just a top that I have on underneath. And these ties can be kind of wrapped around, tied in the front, tied in the back, or, you know, you can skip the ties for a looser fit. But yeah, I just love how breathable and easy this dress is. And then the one other surprise is that I made a matching bucket hat. This is a pattern by LB Textiles. It's the Sorrento bucket hat. And I think it's $2, and it goes to charity, which is awesome. But it also is something that I've made like 50 of. So I love this freaking hat, and I'm making a matching bucket hat for literally every piece of my wardrobe from now on. Anyway, that's it. So I hope that if you were sewing along at home, that you found this helpful and inspiring. And if you're just watching it to get stoked about sewing, I hope that this sparks more passion for sewing in your life. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and we'll be back with more sewing videos next week.